watching all of the services for former President Bush, I've come to the conclusion that some things that really matter at the end, faith, family, those are the things that matter the most. And I heard that over and over again. And what that reminded me of was my father's memorial service. It was actually the same day as Vince's father's service. That. And Pastor John that day had visited my father just a few days before he passed. And at that point, the Cleveland Indians were on a real hot streak. And he said, John, that was my dad's name, talk about things that really matter. His faith, his church, his family. My daughter had just had Brendan. Now, they had never met, but he was talking about his great-grandson. The things that really matter. And those are the things that came out of George Bush's life. His faith was very important. And one thing that the commentators mentioned, he wasn't overly vocal about his faith in Christ, but he definitely lived that way. One story that I heard, and you may have heard the same thing, that amazed me, that when he was living at the White House, he was there for 12 years, 8 with Reagan and 4 of his own. The elevator operator in the White House passed away. And Bush wanted to do the eulogy for the operator. Most presidents don't have the time of day for the low workers there in the White House. But he had time.
We missed that. I missed that.
And actually, that commentary fits right into today's lesson. We're going to talk about a book that we know a whole lot about, Habakkuk. Yeah, right. How do we even say the word? Faith in God enables us to persevere in troubled times. Faith in God enables us to persevere in troubled times. And we're going to talk about faith in troubled times. All of us go through troubles. Everyone. It doesn't matter gender, it doesn't matter age, it doesn't matter race, it doesn't matter income, urban, rural. Everyone goes through troubled times. The key is, what do we have to rely on during those times of trouble? Come on in, Beverly.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Do we have a faith that will be able to sustain us in the troubled times? And that's what we're going to look at today. Habakkuk lived in a very troubled time. He lived in Judah just prior to the Babylonian captivity. It was pretty much a godless society. So you had a man of God, called by God, witnessing the deterioration, the sin in society, and wondering why this is happening, why God is doing this. Everybody has questions they would like to ask God about life and faith. Today's study focuses on a prophet who asked God the same questions that many of us would like to ask today. Habakkuk prophesied to Judah shortly before the nation fell to the Babylonians and went into exile in 586. During these harsh times, the prophet posed sincere questions to the Lord, and God answered him in detail. As we examine the book, we can find comfort in knowing that God does not mind our sincere questions, and He often provides answers, which may or may not contain what we want to hear. Isn't that true? God may tell us things we don't want to hear. Yet in the end, we must remain focused on God's faithfulness. There is nothing wrong with questioning God. Even Jesus questioned God on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? He was wondering why. He knew why he was on the cross, But an emotional strain, the physical strain at that point was so overwhelming, he cried out to God. The thing is about questioning God is we need to do it in a sincere way. Marilyn?
Wasn't, God couldn't look at him when he was on the cross.
Exactly right. And why was that? Because God is an absolutely pure and holy God. And one thing that we oftentimes miss or may not really see is that Jesus became sin. He took upon himself our sin. So every sin that had ever been committed from the time of Adam and Eve until the culmination of the world was on Jesus. Murder, rape, incest, racism, sex, just everything, adultery, all of the sins, marital unfaithfulness. I'm not saying Jesus was those things, but he took upon himself all of those things. And a pure and holy God cannot look on sin, and so God turned away. And Jesus was absolutely all alone. A lot of us deal with loneliness, but at least we've got God. Imagine what life would be like if God turned away and we didn't even have God. The sad tragedy is that there are many who don't have God in their lives. Many who mock God, who mock the church. Heard the other day the chairman of the Democratic Committee, National Committee, say that one of the problems with America today is the church. Because people listen to their pastors preach from the pulpit, and that's one of the problems. I don't think that's one of the problems in the country.
I don't think the people were there to preach to.
Did you see that church up in Massachusetts, what they did? The baby Jesus, they have a creche outside. They put Jesus in a cage.
What? A cage.
In a cage.
So nobody
Because like the immigrants were put in cages.
Yeah, I saw that.
There's a large outcry against that. They interviewed one of the women that go to that church, and she says, I go to church to worship God, to pray, to fellowship. I don't go to church for political things. Our society is so wrong. There's so many things wrong. Habakkuk 1 to 3:18 actually is our key verse. Habakkuk 3:18. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. But the one thing that really matters when everything goes wrong is our relationship to God. And it's tried and it's true. And I've never seen an elderly saint say, boy, that's the dumbest thing I ever did when I gave my life to Jesus 50, 60, 70 years ago. That was dumb. I should have never done that. What I have seen are people that come to faith later in life say, I wish I'd have done this sooner. Coming to faith in Christ does not guarantee an easy life. In fact, it almost guarantees your life is going to be very hard. Just because you're going against the grain, you're serving the Lord, you're working for the Lord, and it's just going to be different. And you're going to have a lot of opposition. There is comfort in knowing that God did not rebuke Habakkuk for the questions he asked. Instead, God answered the prophet. He had a plan to address the evils happening in Judah. And there are evils happening in America. America is becoming less and less following God, less and less of a Christian nation. In fact, theologians call America today a post-Christian country where we moved away from Christianity. Now, of course, there are pockets of Christianity within the country, but society has moved away from that. We might wonder what would amaze Habakkuk about God's plan. Habakkuk knew of his nation's unique place in history, and he knew of God's many blessings in the past. It was inconceivable that God would use a godless nation to judge them. And yet that's exactly what God did. A godless nation. Who would that be? The Babylonians. Who was the head of the Babylonians? Nebuchadnezzar. What do we know about Nebuchadnezzar? He had a thing that people should worship him. Remember, he had statues built, and people would bow down and worship him. In fact, in the book of Daniel, it got the 3 Hebrew prophets in a lot of trouble. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because they refused to bow down and worship the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. So what happened to them? They were thrown in the fiery furnace. Daniel, in the book of Daniel, refused to pray, and he was put in the lion's den. So Nebuchadnezzar was not a friend of the Jewish people. He was not a friend of God. Although he did become that later in his life. But at this point, how could God use a godless nation to judge his own people? And that's precisely what he did. And why? Because God is God. He is sovereign. He can do whatever he wants to do. Something I discovered a long time ago. About the time you put God in a box, he breaks it open. You figure God out, and this is how he's going to always work in every situation. That box doesn't last very long. He will do whatever he will do. God described how the ruthless and impetuous, bitter and hasty Babylonians would conquer Judah. It would be a time of terrible violence and destruction. Perhaps worst of all, the Babylonians were arrogant, setting themselves up in God's place by honoring themselves and living by their own set of laws. Their destruction and terror seemed limitless. The Lord concluded by describing Judah's sad future in stark terms. Declares that a common method of warfare in the Old Testament times, cities were protected by walls. Cities were protected by walls. So armies would lay siege to them, building earthen rafts to swarm the city, while citizens watched helplessly. These people were ruthless, they were brutal, and they came and they did a tremendous amount of destruction. And remember, all of the leading citizens were taken captive back to Babylon. That would be the kings and the royalty, the priesthood, the prophets, the higher echelons of society. There were people that were not taken away. They remained, but there wasn't much left. God did use a godless society to judge his own people. In fact, the thought just came into my head. God used a godless people, the Romans, to crucify his son. Same scenario. The Romans certainly had emperor worship. The emperor, no matter who it was viewed as being godlike, and the people worshipped him. And the Romans were equally brutal. The things that were done to Jesus on the cross and leading up to that. Just watch that Mel Gibson movie from a number of years ago, The Last Passion of Christ. Brutal. Absolutely brutal. So yeah, God can and does use godless things to accomplish his will because he is God. I am raising up the Babylonians, the ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. So God is going to use the Babylonians to bring judgment on his people. This is the time of Habakkuk. He knows what's coming. And there's nothing he can do to stop it. God's mind has been made up. The line has been crossed. Sin has to be judged. And no matter what Habakkuk does, God is still going to bring judgment on the people. Why? Because the people have rejected God. They have fallen for other gods. They worship other gods and have turned away from the Most High God. And God begins to move in judgment. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Habakkuk was in tune with the things of God. And he knew it was going to happen. He knew why it was going to happen. But it still troubled him. And again, there is nothing wrong with questioning God, as long as those questions are sincere and not meant as a mockery, not as meant to try to demean God. Yes, Vince.
You know, this is going to tie into the message this morning, but you know,
How many times does that happen?
It happens every Sunday. You know, when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary and said, you know, you're going to bring the Son of God into the world. She questioned. She said, you know, how, it wasn't doubt like Zechariah. She's just wondering how God's going to do it because she was a virgin and she was never with man. And you know, that was her question. She said, how's God going to do this? And then he explained it to her. But, you know, like you say, sometimes we question. What's going on?
And sometimes when we're absolutely obedient to God, it gets us in a lot of trouble. The example of Mary. Okay, it was one thing to conceive and have a child, but she had some issues on her hands. Dealing with Joseph. How do you tell the one that you're going to marry that you're with child and he knows it's not his? She had a real issue. Not only that, she had an issue with her family. She was a young, unmarried virgin. And it was obvious that she was with child. In that society, was not highly tolerant of young girls who were having children out of wedlock. She had her father to deal with, her mother to deal with. She had society.
Try to explain that to a small little town, that you saw an angel and you're going to be with child even though you haven't had relations with your fiance. I'm trying to explain that to a small little town.
And actually, it took an angelic vision to set Joseph right. Because honestly, he didn't believe Mary. He didn't believe any of it. What you're telling me is impossible. I know you were with somebody. Tell me who it was. Who is he? And Joseph really questioned until the angel Gabriel came to him and said, no, you got this wrong. The power of the Most High God has overshadowed her. This is from God. And from that point on, Joseph believed Mary and believed that something special was going to happen. Is it any wonder that Mary went away for a number of months to be with Elizabeth, her cousin, who was also with child? Now, their situations were very different. Elizabeth was much older, beyond the age of childbearing. And she had conceived, and who was in her womb? John the Baptist. What does Scripture tell us? That when Mary came in, the baby in Elizabeth's womb leapt for joy. And that was John the Baptist. So God He is absolutely in control, and he will use whatever he can use to accomplish his will. From a young virgin to a Roman army to crucify Jesus, to the Babylonians to bring judgment on the people of Judah. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you about while the wicked swallow up their more righteous than themselves? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? And it's an honest question. Why are you letting this happen? Basic answer, I'm God. I can do whatever I want. What's that?
He does.
And he does. And a lot of times, we're in situations we don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense. And yet we can see how God is leading us. How one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. In my own case, and I've shared this before, that when I left Pittsburgh and moved up with my brother and sister-in-law, I had no place to attend church. I could have gone back to my home church, but I didn't want to go back there primarily to have it be seen like I was trying to push the pastor out. I had too much respect for him, and I don't think people would have thought that. Some might have, but I just didn't want the appearance of I'm trying to push the pastor at First Baptist Sharon out. So I do go there occasionally, but I don't worship there on a regular basis. Of course, you know that. So I ended up going to a large church, which incidentally, I didn't even know existed until like a year before I moved up here. When I went to my sister's for Easter dinner, I went right past that church, and the thought popped in my mind, oh, if I ever move back up here, I'll go to that church. Having no idea that I'd be moving back up here a little more than a year from then. Going that church led me to Pastor Joe Nevin. I got involved with him, and some of the best times of ministry was Pastor Joe and I traveling around to hospitals, and I still tell the story, I'm sure he still does, the one day that we went to 5 different hospitals in one day. 3 in Pittsburgh, then we went to the Farrell Hospital and Sharon Hospital. I said, Joe, I've never done that in my life. I've gone to hospitals, but not 5 in one day. Then Joe started coming to the Eagle's Nest, and he invited me, and here it is 3 years later, I'm still here.
Good. Praise the Lord.
God had a way of leading me. By coming up for Easter dinner, I saw the church. By attending there, I got involved with Pastor Joe. Pastor Joe brought me to Eagle's Nest, and I'm still here. God was leading, and he has a way of doing that. Although at the time, we may not necessarily see that. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. So Habakkuk is going to wait to hear from God, to hear what God has to say. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. What is a herald? Oh, that paper down in Sharon, that's the herald. Herald means messenger. It's another word for messenger. And it's not a word that we use a lot, not a word that we see a lot, but it simply means messenger. Habakkuk was saying, I'm going to wait for a messenger to come and to explain these things to me. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it, it will certainly come and will not delay. God always answers at the time of his choosing. Not necessarily our choosing or our way, but God always answers. in the time and in the way that he sees fit. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. God is faithful. He will never turn his back on his children. He will always love us. He may chasten us. He may cause us some pain for different reasons, but he will not turn away. Jesus said that I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I am with you. And we have that knowledge. And again, when it comes right down to it, at the very end of life, what are the things that really matter? How many men that are on their deathbed are saying, oh, I wish I'd have earned more money? How many are saying, oh, I wish I would have worked harder? A lot of times you're saying, I wish I'd have spent more time with my family. I wish I'd have spent more time serving God. Those are the things that really matter. The bank account really doesn't. It really doesn't matter at the end. There was a funeral director that I worked with quite often when I was in my first church. And on our way out to the cemetery, a lot of times it'd just be the two of us in the car going to a cemetery. I worked with him a number of years. We had dozens of funerals together. And he said to me a couple of different times, I have never in all my years of being in this business seen an armored car following our hearse out to the cemetery. He says, I've never seen that. And I had never seen it either. And he and I had a good relationship. I really liked working with him. He was the guy that was in town, although he was the Catholic funeral director in town. And there were some people in that town that had a very deep dislike for the Catholics, so when they would die, they would go to the Protestant uptown. So I ended up dealing with that guy too, which we all got along with fine. But you can't take it with us. What really mattered to George Bush in the waning hours was his faith in God. Young George tells the story, and you may have heard this, that he received a phone call that his father only had minutes to live. Apparently he declined very quickly. And there was no way that George was going to be able to get there before his father passed. So he called. And some man answered the phone. He doesn't know who it was. And he said, well, he's pretty much been unresponsive for quite a while. We don't know if he's going to hear you or what his response is. And George says, put the phone up by his head. Something I want to tell him. And he said, Dad, I love you. And what did George say? I love you too. Those are the last words he ever spoke. And that reminds me of something that happened to me very similar to that. My mother was in Sharon Hospital with colon cancer, and it went very quickly. I received a call on Friday that it had spread. They were putting her in hospice care. I was not able to make it up over the weekend. On Monday, I received a call from my sister-in-law saying that this is really bad. She's only got a few days to go. Mom wants to talk to you. And she picked up the phone. I said, how you doing? She says, I'm in a lot of pain. It really hurts. And I said, well, they'll give you something for that pain. And she said to me, I want you to know this, I love you. It's the last words I ever heard her speak. Just a short while after, they medicated her, and she never responded again. When I did make it up to the hospital within a day or so, totally unresponsive. She was so overly medicated, and that was just for a point of comfort then. What really matters? Faith in God, family. Habakkuk understood that. And we need to understand that. With all the hoopla about the holidays and Christmas, what is it really about? A baby in a manger.